depends upon the man in the Kremlin, and he thinks he's winning this war. So it's not clear to me why he should make Donald Trump the great peacemaker who ends it, and that Putin has to go back in his box and doesn't get almost anything that he wants except possibly a large chunk of Donbass. That's not why he started this war. It was entirely for different reasons.
Delighted to have James Nixey from the Conflict Studies Research Centre with me. James, an Oval Office meeting on Monday that didn't end in angry scenes, in excruciating scenes. Will Zelensky be relieved or maybe hopeful today?
Yeah, I know. Remarkable, isn't it? The turnaround since February. Relief is surely one of the things, because ambush or some form of repetition, the fact that Putin spoke to Trump last, would all have worried the Europeans. And I think Zelensky must have been very grateful that he had so many prominent Europeans flanking him up. Those were remarkable, unprecedented scenes. So many, if you will, powerful people in one room at once. I suppose with the twin aim of ensuring that Zelensky didn't rise to any bait if he was offered any, and ensuring that Trump didn't go wobbly in terms of pushing all of Vladimir Putin's designs and desires onto Zelensky all at once. So it was a well-constructed, well-thought-out, almost reverse ambush, I suppose. I suppose the Americans would not have ideally liked all of those Europeans there. They'd forced themselves into the room effectively, and then it's much harder to browbeat 7 or 8 people than just one from one small nation, which he doesn't really clearly care that much about. So I think it was quite a remarkable effort from the European leaders, quite frankly, as well as Zelensky himself, who performed admirably.
For Zelensky, the positive takeaway that he's been talking about is Trump's pledge of security assistance. That Zelensky says will be formalized soon. What's your sense of what that mooted security guarantee could look like?
Well, what they want it to look like is very similar to Article 5 of NATO, whereby an attack against one is an attack against all. And that would be the ideal. Although it should be said that Article 5 doesn't automatically mean, in NATO terms, that everybody suddenly joins in the bunfight. In fact, what it means is they get together and decide what to do in defense of the injured party. But my sense is this has been slightly over-egged, and that this is not a cast iron security guarantee in the way that Article 5 is supposed to be. It's hard to see some countries committing troops on the ground in Ukraine, fighting in particular in the air as well, by the way, because that has been such a bugbear for the MAGA crowd in particular, although I understand that some things are changing within that particular polity. So that's one thing. So I do think that this is my understanding is that these security guarantees are sub Article 5, and in fact, quite frankly, that they would be in deference to the United Nations, which obviously contains Russia on the permanent 5 of the Security Council, and that Russia would have to authorize it themselves. So that's really like turkeys and Christmas. So I'm skeptical here, but mostly I'm skeptical here, and I'm sorry to be such a sort of a downcast pessimist, but because it does seem to me that if you take this optimistic scenario whereby Ukraine draws the lines on the line of contact right now, and you have a peacekeeping force of some sort, a reassurance force of some sort, and that Vladimir Putin is effectively put back in his place, that just doesn't sound like Vladimir Putin to me. So I think the one thing that I have noticed as being absent from all the analysis that we've seen in the last sort of less than 24 hours is what Russia's reaction is. And that's partly because we don't know, because they haven't reacted properly yet as far as I've seen this morning. And because it does go against the very core of what Vladimir Putin wants. And we know kind of what he wants from the November and December so-called security treaties or ultimata, which gave Ukraine sort of a matter of weeks to fulfill them before Russia would invade. It wasn't possible to do so because it required NATO retreating to pre-1991 lines, amongst other things, and I think it requires a little bit of psychological analysis of Vladimir Putin to understand that he is not a man for compromise, not one for ceding territories, not one for accepting that Ukraine or that the West has any business doing anything in Ukraine, up to and including EU membership, never mind NATO membership. Vladimir Putin regards Ukraine as an indelible part of Russia, that Russia cannot be Russia without Ukraine being part of it or attached to it as you wish. So I think that the fly in the ointment is still to come in a way. I mean, I suppose, much as we think that the US has drifted, and I'm sure that's correct, in the last 6 months, then ultimately they are all mature liberal democracies with a question mark on the liberal, shall we say. And that has meant that it has not been, that's an easier proposition than negotiating with somebody who doesn't hold the same standards, values, isn't bound by treaties. And so therefore, if you go back to your security guarantees question, then the question is how to make it less like the Budapest Memorandum, which was trampled all over, and more like Article 5 of NATO. And that the devil in that detail is yet to be sorted.
Ahead of this meeting in the Oval Office, the Kremlin again said no NATO troops in Ukraine, which perhaps would suggest any kind of security guarantees involving other countries, perhaps the type of countries that get involved in UN peacekeeping forces may be satisfactory to Russia?
Possibly. It counts out the Turks, of course, because the Turks are in NATO. The Chinese have been mooted, but it's very unclear that the Chinese want such a thing. It's a little bit hard to see where they might come from. Mercenaries have been mooted, but again, that would not be acceptable to, I think, the Western powers and to Ukraine in particular. So it doesn't strike me as being it's easier said than done. I mean, if you're looking at scrabbling around for ideas, then of course the other point is maybe not so much troops on the ground but planes in the air, whereby they do get back to creating a no-fly zone or a bubble or a series of interconnected bubbles, which would also give the Ukrainians some respite. But of course, for that, in a sense, for that you need the ceasefire. The ceasefire is not coming; it's a peace deal now.
And I suppose long term, any kind of arrangement like that would risk countries being committed for decades to stop this just from restarting again, as we see with Cyprus after 1974 or Sinai.
Absolutely, and you can't see NATO planes, for example, circling the Ukrainian airways, ad infinitum. It's simply not. It's not economically or physically possible. So that's why I think that this is. It's great that the Europeans and the Ukrainians seem to have more or less brought Donald Trump on side for now, although obviously he can blow hot and cold, swings one way and then another, depending upon the last person he speaks to. He could go back to, either to Putin or even to Vance and Rubio and change his mind within hours, I suppose. But as far as it's just, it's very hard to see the Russians agreeing to what the Western media seems to think has been put in place already.
Donald Trump, for now, says he's arranging a meeting between Presidents Putin and Zelensky that some say could come in the next 2 weeks. Do you think Vladimir Putin will go to Hungary or wherever it may be? And is there any point, with Ukraine all but rejecting Russia's continuing demand to hand over more territory?
I mean, I find it hard to imagine that Vladimir Putin would deign to sit down at the same table with Volodymyr Zelensky, something he hasn't done since the mid-2010s. He obviously, the person who doesn't go to a table will look like the more spoilt of the children, and he will, and I think Zelensky will do that on the basis that he he has promised that he would do. I think he would be obligated to turn up. It's worth noting that President Macron has counter-suggested a quad format, whereby Europe is in there in some position, meaning him, I think, representing Europe. That would, of course, give Zelensky a little bit of extra ballast on his side if Trump and Putin decide to gang up on him. Not an impossibility, as we've seen before. It's possible, but I think, again, I hate to keep coming down to the same point, but I think it all depends upon the man in the Kremlin, and he thinks he's winning this war. So it's not clear to me why he should make Donald Trump the great peacemaker who ends it, and that Putin has to go back in his box and doesn't get almost anything that he wants except possibly a large chunk of Donbass. That's not why he started this war. It was entirely for different reasons.
Whether a trilateral meeting with Trump, a quadrilateral meeting with Macron as well, is there a route to peace that would work for Vladimir Putin, that would be palatable to Zelensky and to the people of Ukraine? Is there a middle way that we can find?
I have my doubts. Sorry to be the fly in the ointment yet again, because I think if you think about Vladimir Putin is 72, almost 73, and he started this war probably knowing that he's got more years behind him and in front of him, and that he hasn't achieved what he wants for the gathering of Russian lands, for the greatness of Ukraine. So he used this muscular military option because the diplomatic options of telling Ukraine where it should be geopolitically positioned, simply wasn't working. So that can't have changed. It doesn't seem to have changed. And of course, for one thing, has been consistent not just in recent weeks, in the tumult of recent weeks, the fluidity of recent weeks, and of recent years, is that Russia's position seems to be unchanged. They haven't conceded anything to our knowledge. So, I mean, I know Vitkov said that he had conceded the Western Security Assistance Form package, but in fact, that does not look like a concession because if you flip that, then actually that means that the US has to get Russian permission to do security in Europe. It doesn't make any sense. So I don't think there's any concession at all, and probably Steve Vitkov rather misunderstood that willfully or unwillfully. So to go back to the question of any sort of realistic chance of a viable peace, I think that's very difficult while Russia still believes it's in a strong position. If it thinks it can win on the battlefield and it's not going to economically collapse, and it's not, by the way, at least not in the immediate future. Obviously, it's systemically massively challenged, bearing in mind what it's doing to its economy, but it's okay for now. Unless things are I suppose the caveat I'd put on that is unless things are worse for Russia than we realize, as they were at the end of the Soviet times, when it collapsed sooner than almost all analysts understood. When it came fast. So I would imagine that actually the battlefield situation is not conducive, is not aligned to a diplomatic settlement, despite the political will for it.
So what happens in Ukraine if Zelensky agrees to a settlement that perhaps meets most of Putin's maximalist demands? Do we see civil unrest there, or does Ukraine just have to walk away from this whole process and perhaps hand a propaganda victory to Russia again?
So I was in Ukraine 3 weeks ago, and I happened to be there during the protests on the anti-corruption issue. And it was quite extraordinary to see the people of Ukraine come out in defiance of their government, but saying quite crucially that, listen, we support our government, we support Zelensky in the war, but not in this anti-corruption maneuver, which is outrageous, and we didn't fight and die for this. So I think that Zelensky must be aware that he has got one of the most politically sensitive populations in the world who are able to mobilize and come out on the street if they are betrayed. So what does being betrayed mean? Would they be willing to cede some land? And the answer to that is quite possibly yes, if it weren't for the problem that it's not about land. Because this is not about land for Russia. I mean, it's about control. Russia needs to control Ukraine. It doesn't need Ukraine's land per se. It just had to go in that way, as I say, because it wasn't getting it any other way. So if if Zelensky cedes control of some sort, then I think that is a more dangerous position for him politically. If he were to say, listen, I can't get you Crimea, I can't get you some of Donbass, then that might be accepted by the Ukrainian population temporarily, but not having it codified. That's one of the problems might be in codification, because, of course, part of the Russian demands are to ensure that this is accepted de jure, not just de facto.
If we circle back to where we started, Monday's Oval Office meeting, it's clear there's a clear aggressor and a clear victim here. Will Donald Trump, or has Donald Trump come to appreciate this?
I mean, it's very hard to say, isn't it? Because it's like sort of trying to nail down water with Donald Trump. I mean, you think you might have an agreement, and then it comes out differently on the other side, or then he talks to somebody else, or then he talks to his advisors, talks to his adversaries, then goes back to talking to us, and so you just don't know quite where he stands. If it's any consolation, then that does off-put or wrong-foot the Russians as much as it does us. They equally, presumably, cannot know where Donald Trump stands, unless there's something that they know that we don't about him being a Russian asset. But if you ignore that for a second, then I think that it's much more likely that this is, because we're not dealing with a professional politician, he doesn't really have the the deftness or the skills to act and stay acted upon. He's much in his style of governance is so much more singular and centralized around himself, and everybody else scrabbling to keep up, as we have seen in his entourage, who did not support him, but of course now very much do so. And so it's really hard to pinpoint Donald Trump. I mean, I do say that frequently, but Vladimir Putin is much easier to understand. We can understand his motivations, his background, his writings, his speeches, and there is quite, and also in addition to that, there's a great deal of consistency. And Donald Trump is nothing if not inconsistent. And so I don't know if he has come round, or if this is simply the latest maneuver in a shambolic or not shambolic, effort to sort of muddle through this. He's obviously claiming that he wants peace. And actually, do you know what? I believe that. I think he does want this war over. That is true, and that's possibly, that is different to his Russian counterpart. Vladimir Putin probably wants the war to continue because he thinks he is winning it, and he can get more on the battlefield than he can around the table. But whether that's enough for an intrinsically pro-Russian, but for an administration which is at least more pro-great power and more anti-little power, calling Ukraine a little power is a bit strange, but than before. So, yeah, it's not clear to me that Donald Trump has been won over, but I would regard Monday as a success for Western liberal powers and Ukraine after the nerves that were created in the immediate aftermath of Alaska.
James Nixey, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure. Really appreciate that.